Hi, and welcome to our fifth module, where we continue our discussion about technological innovation strategy. In module 4, we talked about appraising a firm's environment, articulating an ambitious strategic intent. And for this module, we will focus on appraising the firm's strengths, weaknesses, competitive advantages, business models, core competencies, as well as look at the timing of entry. So in our first section, we're kind of thinking a little bit more about the firm's current position, right? And think about, you have technologies or innovations, and how does kind of the organizational structure of the firm and the position in the competitive space kind of affect you building your technology portfolio and innovation portfolio. You will have probably learned that beforehand in a strategy class or in an organizational behavior class. But typically, we're talking about sustainable competitive advantage. That's a pretty common management term. And the idea is there's typically 4 components to that, right? The advantage has to be rare, has to be valuable, durable, and inimitable. And most of the conversations are about resources, right? So we're really focusing on what the resources of the firms are and how can we build these resources, and which of these resources really give us this advantage. Resources that are typically difficult to imitate are tacit, path-dependent, socially complex, causally ambiguous. Tacit, so you have situations like like a firm's culture, for example, that you might be able to describe to an outside spectator, but it's really hard to fully capture in writing, right? Look, there isn't really a manual on a firm's culture. A lot of cultural elements that are not included in how firms conduct business. Could be, for example, how are people communicating with each other? Do they have, is there kind of a spirit of communication between different divisions? Is that encouraged? Are there particular ways of how ideas are expressed and supported? Which also is then a connection to socially complex, right? So we have tacit and socially complex are often kind of a combination term, just because we can't really fully capture that in written form. Path dependent, right? So there's a historical sequence of events that might have given you that resource. It could be real estate, right? So if you'd been an early real estate investor, or, like McDonald's has essentially grown through their franchise system, but their franchise system essentially being real estate development for that location. That could give you a path-dependent advantage, right? That just accumulates over time, and it's hard for competitors to imitate. Causally ambiguous, right? And so that's a little more tricky. Sometimes there are advantages, right? Or the way resources are distributed, or the kind of advantage, the outputs that you generate can't necessarily be connected to a very clear chain of events, right? So let's say you've done a really good job in terms of innovation, or you're always very good in particular product categories. There is particular things that you do within a company that you haven't really built an empirical model around, right? So nobody really knows exactly, mostly because it wasn't measured properly. But nobody really knows exactly how certain things combine to provide certain outputs. Now, causally ambiguous is good to be for outside parties, right? We don't want outside parties to really figure out what gives us the advantage. But internally, we do want to figure that out, right? So sometimes when managers or division chiefs don't know why the company is doing such a good job, it's mostly because of a lack of measurement, or a lack of being able to build the right metrics assess these things. All right, so important concept here is what we call a core competency, right? And so typically you have some sort of abilities in the company. They might be, within a business unit, across business units. It's clear that, core competencies are some things that you can control, right? So you can build a core competency, you can improve your core competency. And so ideally, your core competency should span across the firm. And especially when you do innovation projects or when you develop, new technologies, you need to figure out how can you essentially build this kind of range of core competencies across the company that can give you a competitive advantage. And this is kind of a brief visualization. Typically, when people talk about silos, it's often the case that different business units have these different core competencies and they're not really shared across the firm. And so because they are so focused on particular business units, it's really provides some complications in terms of strategy as well, right? Because you want to compete with other companies or you want to compete in the marketplace. Think about the example that we talked about, the LED lamps, right? We know that there are some units within the company that do really good development work. We also kind of want to be careful as to how far along we want to bring this project internally, because there's just a lot of hurdles and there is a administrative process to bring projects forward, right? And so because these different business units have different administrative processes and different administrative, let's say, hurdles, companies often struggle to find their core or build core competencies across different business units. And that immediately brings us to core rigidities, right? And so the idea here is that when I do something really well, I tend to keep investing in it. And if I do something really well, I also rarely going to make a 180-degree turn and just do something completely different, right? I typically try to enhance my strengths and minimize my weaknesses. But the problem here is that core competencies, right, depending on what the market situation is, how technology has progressed, what are kind of the external factors to my environment, these can potentially cement a path that is not very sustainable in the future, right? So if I'm really good at producing certain technologies or certain technological features, but these technological features aren't in need anymore, then my core competency becomes a core rigidity. And so a very important aspect of companies is to develop what's called a dynamic capability, right? Is to be able to, put core competencies to rest, develop new core competencies, and adjust that depending on how the external environment is kind of responding. This is an example. This was called the Porter's value chain, but here the idea is, right, we think about a firm, we can build this firm, we can kind of disassemble the firm in different components, right? We have a firm infrastructure, human resource management, technology development, procurement, logistics, operations, marketing, service, and of course there are other components here. But the idea is, where do I stand, right? How are these components aligned such that I can get the innovation or technology outputs that I want to, right? And so when we take a more technological position here, is we can look at these components that we developed, that we discussed here, and we can see how different technologies help us have a better output there, right? So whether it's training technology for human resource management, motivation research, whether it's using computer-aided design or other technologies to develop new products, right? Or visualize new products. Procurement, transportation, operations, etc. All these are helpful views to think about where technology can affect them, right? And innovation as well. So are there new innovations that I can integrate, or existing innovations that I can license or take and improve my operations? Are there particular innovations I could develop that could help me improve in any of these areas? You can imagine that Amazon, for example, who's very operationally focused, does a lot of R&D into how they can improve their outcomes in those areas. Obviously, right, we know we have entrepreneurial firms, we know we have big Fortune 500 companies, and structures within the firm can affect how creativity and innovation is moving forward, right? We talked about this in the previous modules. What kind of incentive systems can I build? And so the idea here is, depending on the firm structure, right, and the firm scope and how large and how complex their products are, you can imagine that these structures can either foster creativity and experimentation or hinder that, right? And so we have to think a little bit about these things. There are some factors here to consider. Schumpeter, which has been a pretty well-cited economist in the 1950s. In the 1940s, he argued that if you're larger, you have just more capabilities to obtain financing, right? It's easier for you to spread costs of R&D over your large volume, and so you have bigger economies of scale, and also you can take on more risky projects, right? Because if you have enough cash or you have enough revenue and profit, you can spend, you have enough disposable income, so to speak, to take some experiments, and those experiments could be important for you moving forward. Then at the same time, right, so when we think about large companies, we talked about the bureaucratic inertia. You often have strategic commitments to certain technologies, right, because you've made partnerships with other companies, because it's really hard to change technologies internally. Just think about software. Imagine you have to switch from Microsoft to OpenOffice, for example, or Microsoft Word to Google Documents, right? So there is some transition issues that you have to think about, and so overall, you have to really think about how do you adjust the structure of large companies. That's especially a problem with large companies, because smaller companies tend to be more experimentation driven, right? Startups don't have that much bureaucracy. People come and go pretty informally. But how do you create this feeling of small that can help you kind of move projects forward? And so this is an example. Xerox and what they call the Icarus project. Everybody knows, well, not if you don't know who Icarus was, there's a quick summary here. But the idea is really that if you're Xerox, right, and you're an innovation leader in the 60s and 70s, you have a stranglehold on photocopiers. You don't really think much about your lower cost competitors, right? Because you define yourself through innovation, through technology advancement, et cetera. But the problem is that, especially the Japanese and other Asian companies who actually got like a later start in the 60s and 70s, started to compete on price, right? So they were essentially producing similar quality or products with fewer features, but still a pretty good quality for a lot less money. And so it was relatively easy for companies to switch. Photocopiers aren't really, at that time, weren't really such integrated products, right? Essentially, you just take one out and put another one in. There's a little training, right, that people have to do, but typically they're pretty straightforward. And so that's why it made it hard for Xerox to hold on their position unless they would innovate the photocopier market dramatically. And so that's why they had, by the mid-70s, although they were the innovation leaders, think about first mover and second mover here, but their competitors that came onto the market kind of led them to have to restructure their business. Again, there's also different, we talked about structural dimensions of the firm here, but so firms use rules, right? You have worked for companies that use rules and procedures. People that have been in the military use rules and procedures. And they try to do that such that they can predict and structure the behavior of employees, right? Or people who are part of the organization. And that has a few advantages, one of which, of course, is that if you can control certain behaviors or you can guide certain behaviors, you can kind of also guide the overall direction of the firm. The problem is that once you do that, once you get too procedural and too much rule-based, you create these rigidities, right? And especially if you're in a if you're developing new innovations or you're basing yourself on creativity outputs, this can kind of stifle these kind of things. And the same goes, of course, with standardization. Standardization is very helpful, right? Think about McDonald's. If McDonald's would let employees do what they want in their burger joints, things would just run very differently, right, from location to location. And so for companies that are depending on operational excellence, standardization makes a lot of sense. But again, the counterpoint to this is that you might have some innovation stifling, right? So you have to balance these two things. Centralization, right? The question here is, how do I organize my company? How are decisions made? Who has to countersign? What kind of input do I need? Et cetera, et cetera. We know these have been ongoing debates whether a company should be more centralized or decentralized. Really, the idea, the plus and minuses is if you want to facilitate, if you have a firm-wide innovation that you really want to get through the entire company and you want to make sure you have good adoption rates, you need a level of centralization. If you're interested if you're okay with having different types of innovation or technology outputs or different types of creative outputs, then decentralization makes a lot of sense, right? You still need somebody to kind of coordinate things, to kind of figure out what the outcome should be. But there are scenarios where decentralization might be perfectly okay, right? If you give people a lot of autonomy, they generate a lot of creative output. And that output has some utility. You can think about universities, right? So universities have some centralization, right? There's some administration around to organize things, pay and human resource issues. But when it comes to creative output, faculty have full autonomy in what they're doing, right? And again, that has some pluses and minuses, but that's what we call freedom of research, right? So academic freedom is part of that. And again, that can be positive or negative. But again, it depends on the organization, depends what your strategic intent is, depends what your overall goals are in the marketplace, right? And that's how you have to structure firms. And the problem often is that companies have these misalignments, right, between what their goals are and how their structure actually counteracts these goals. And so that's kind of the issues that we typically have to deal with in these issues. All right, so that concludes the first section of Module 5. The next section will be business models. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you very soon.